Hi everyone, I hope you're enjoying my guide to Europe. So far we've been to Paris and we've been to Edinburgh, but you can't say that you have done all the great sights of Europe without swinging past Italy and visiting the most iconic Roman site of them all, the Colosseum. And I say this with hand on my heart. Europe, well, it's great to visit in summer, isn't it? Amazing, actually. You know, the feeling, the heat. Everything about Europe in summer changes. The feeling changes as you stroll through Paris or Amsterdam or Berlin. Everything changes. And it changes when you go there again in winter, but it doesn't lose its allure. Winter for me in Europe is also one of the best times to be there. So even though I'm calling this my summer tour, you can pretty much go whenever you like. And to some of these events, I have to say, seeing them in winter is probably a better time because there's less tourists around. That being said, it's a summer tour. So if you're a long-time listener to this podcast, thank you very much. I greatly appreciate it. And I'm now about to take you to one of the most incredible buildings in the world. Enjoy. In 64 AD, Rome was burning. Literally, a great fire swept through the city, destroying a third of it. Scholars trawled through the ashes of the Forum, while mothers and fathers wept in the ruins of their family houses. The city was very much a shadow of its former self. To add injury to insult, what was going to rise from the ashes was an opulent golden palace. Not for the people themselves, but for the emperor. The Domus Aurea, built for the Emperor Nero with his lavish gardens and palatial halls, it would take up something like a third of the city's footprint. Rumors swirled as to whether Nero had actually started the fire himself as part of the land grab. And of course, that rumor has perpetuated down through the ages. I have to say, he was probably the most hated emperor in history. Yet, with his suicide, Rome was actually thrown into further chaos and misery. Hard to imagine. 3 emperors temporarily filled the position, none of them presenting a lasting solution. And it looked like Rome at this stage, their grip on the empire might loosen, and it loosened with each change of emperor. But then a new emperor emerged, Vespasian, a man of humble beginnings whose judgment and self-discipline marked him out as a potential ruler. He vowed to restore Rome to its former glory. He wanted to create something truly new, something extraordinary that would show the people of Rome that the empire was as proud and indomitable as ever before. It would be an arena on a scale unlike anything seen before. A stadium that would rise 50 meters into the sky, that could hold up to 65,000 spectators. A place where people from the furthest reaches of the empire would travel for days just to stand in its shadow. Where the greatest fighters would compete for adoration, for freedom, and effectively for immortality. Also a place where Rome could actually demonstrate its dominion over its enemies. It would sit at the heart of the city purposefully, on top of the foundations of what would have been Nero's palace. This is the story of glory in the Roman Empire, who had it and who would do anything for it. The early autumn sun is bathing the city of Rome in a golden light. There's an energy here today, and that's the same energy that's drawn people here for millennia. The city, like Edinburgh, is cradled between 7 legendary hills that have witnessed a lot of history. You know, the rise and fall of empires, the birth of legends, and in all seriousness, the shaping of the Western world. Someone asked me last year, how often do you think of Rome? How often do you think of Romans? And I had to think about it for about 2 or 3 minutes. But the actual answer is every single day. There's not a day that goes by when I don't think about something that's either Rome or Rome related. Only in Rome do you find Michelangelo Renaissance masterpieces, alongside imperial sites like the Forum, the Parthenon, and the Colosseum. And only in Rome you get crazy Baroque wonders like the Trevi Fountain. All of it just a stone throw away from the headquarters of the Catholic Church. Basilicas like St. Peter's, St. Paul's, every corner. This city is a bewitching blend of art and faith and the echoes of distant past. You literally can't walk through the streets here without feeling the weight of that history. Rome slowly gained power over 5 centuries, and about 500 BC, initially as a monarchy and then a republic, governed by senators, building wealth through trading wine and olive oil. Doing a bit of fighting as well, of course. By about 27 BC, it became one of the mighty empires ruled by Caesar as an emperor. It would rapidly roll over to imperium and empire, which included around 1/3 of the population of the world. Think about that. 1/3 of the world's population bowed to Rome. Its decline, like its former empires in the West, was conquered in about the 5th century AD by people previously regarded as barbarians. For around 4 centuries within that story, the Colosseum stood at the heart of Roman life. Look, it's an absolute marvel of engineering. You cannot stand in its shadow and not gasp. It took about 8 years to complete. It was a feat of astonishing ambition, and it was actually designed by merging 2 semicircular theaters into one massive amphitheater, the largest in the Roman world. Gleaming white limestone, it was once adorned with brightly painted details, and it would have been so colorful. There were statues of the Roman and the Greek gods, Zeus, Jupiter, and Hercules, Venus, all standing proudly in their arches in the middle stories, casting their gaze over the crowds below. In the Colosseum itself, men fought animals. They fought each other. The crowd roared them on. To Romans, this was an old amphitheater and only became the Colosseum in about AD 80. There was a colossal statue of the Emperor Nero that once stood just outside. Spectators queued to get in, clutching their tickets, and would have passed the feet of the gigantic statue. There was also a massive fountain with tumbling layers of water, and it would have been absolutely spectacular. The fountain just outside the Colosseum today is called the Fountain of the Amphiphore. It was built in the 1930s and pretty much moved to its present location in 1935 in the small square just east of the Colosseum. Back in ancient Roman times, there were also fountains there and water sources literally everywhere, since the Colosseum was actually connected to aqueducts, but the originals of those have long since disappeared. Something to keep in mind too, the Colosseum wasn't just built as a venue for gladiatorial games. It had an important political purpose. Vespasian, the emperor who began it in around 77 AD, thought this enormous building would actually help cement his dynasty at the apex of the Roman world. Above the Forum, there is the Palatine Hill, and this is actually where Augustus decided to make his home. You can climb that and stand in that position today. And the very fact that this is where Augustus chose to make his home, above the Colosseum, that's a statement by itself. And of course, many of the later Roman emperors echoed his example. It's a good place. It's up out of the city and would have been far away from the stench of Rome, with incredibly good breezes in summer. Of course, as I was there looking down on the Colosseum itself, I then wondered, what was the state of the empire in 70 AD? So Rome had been expanding. It went south to North Africa. It went east into Greece and Turkey. It got by this point as far as the Middle East. And then under Claudius, it went to West Britain as well. And it's near enough at its territorial peak. It's getting there. But the AD 60s had been an absolute nightmare. There was the Bodecean Revolt in Great Britain in 62, and it's one of the things that the Emperor Nero had to deal with. And look, Britain wasn't necessarily the heart of the Roman Empire at that time, but it's still something that needs to be sorted out. She had eliminated to the man one of Rome's best legions. But actually, by the time we get to the mid-60s, if we're talking in Rome, there's the fire that happens there in 64. And there had been fires in Rome before, but of course, this was huge. And it was devastating for quite a lot of the city. So that was a problem that Nero also had to deal with afterwards. And he plowed lots of money into it with a big building program that actually helped rebuild the city as we knew it, as well as his own palace, of course, which gets remembered very well in all the histories of the period. If I were to sum up Nero, he was the last of the Julio-Claudian emperors. He ruled from 54 to 68 AD. He's, in our history books, as it were, sort of painted as the opposite of the Emperor Augustus. He's very young. He's only 16 when he becomes emperor. He's characterized as being under the thumb of his mother and some powerful advisors who are very good friends to his mother. So he gets characterized as a sort of inexperienced person who is politically naive and then politically very difficult when we get to his later emperorship. So he's someone who isn't necessarily the automatic choice of someone who would actually rule, but just finds himself in that awkward position. He then does things that some would say were popular with the people that were perhaps a bit difficult for the Senate on numerous occasions. But ultimately, he was criticized because he was far too interested in luxury. He was far too interested in his own pursuits. He was far too interested, if truth be told, in the theater. And I think far too interested by far in chariot racing. And I think the Roman senators hated him for all of the above. Let's face it, he's a showman, not a fighter. In AD 68, he's declared the net public enemy by the Senate, and of course he takes his own life. And then there is the year of the four emperors. So the year of the four emperors is 69 AD. And what we have then is what the Senate thought was going to be a very good succession. So when they decide to declare Nero a public enemy, they've actually got a plan. And the plan is supposed to be the rule of an emperor named Galba, who is the opposite to Nero in every single way. He's older, he's got a good military background, he's got the support of his own legion behind him, some 6,000 battle-hardened men. But unfortunately, Galba is not particularly popular with the imperial bodyguard, the Praetorian Guard in Rome. And sources say he doesn't pay them enough. He doesn't give them enough gifts. So he is murdered. And then we move very quickly to the Emperor Otho. His reign was incredibly short-lived, and within just a few months, he faced a challenge from Vitalis, whose legions in Germania actually declared him emperor in exile. Otho's forces were defeated at the Battle of Bedriacum in April 69 AD, and rather than prolong the civil war itself, Otho then commits suicide. Later that same year, Vitalis was overthrown by Vespasian, who was actually supported by two of his own legions in Egypt, so some 10 to 12,000 battle-hardened legionnaires. And this is actually what we call the start of the Flavian dynasty. He also subdued southern England, and he conquered the Isle of Wight for the first time. He was the first emperor to really move into what we now know as Wales. He was also born outside royal circles. He became a senator. He is someone who didn't come from a traditional aristocratic background, but was actually rising in the political elite under the reign of Nero. And of course, he fell out of favor with Nero, it seems, and that's why he was then sent to Judea to subdue the revolt there, in the hope that he would never actually come back. So what we had then was the rule of the Julio-Claudians and all the drama that that produced. And now it's actually time for a less traumatic period. And that's not easy to see as a transitional point. So part of the way that Vespasian actually makes the transition work was to go through a massive building campaign. And this is when he launched some of his big building projects. And I then wondered, of course, if this was just about pleasing the people of Rome, sort of strengthening his grip on power, or is it about his own prestige? So what's actually going on? So part of what Vespasian is probably doing is finishing some of the building projects that Nero had actually started. Remember, Nero is rebuilding Rome when he died because of the massive fire. And Vespasian actually needs to think about what he wants Rome to look like himself. But also, he's got the money pretty much to do whatever he wants. That war that he was sent to subdue in Judea, the spoils of that war, which includes selling prisoners of war into enslavement, is what finances the building of the Colosseum. And of course, it's a big part actually, of what paid for the entire building program that Vespasian puts into place, that then gave the people I think perhaps a different sense and space of what Rome could be. So the lake that was going to be built as part of Nero's Golden Palace was where the Colosseum was eventually built. And what Vespasian is doing is allowing the public back into the place where Nero had been planning his grandiose imperial projects. And there's probably a case to be made too, I think, that Nero might have opened parts of his house to the public as well, to have spectacles there. But this is giving it, I guess, symbolically back into public hands. But we can't move away, or really overlook for that matter, that the Colosseum, this amphitheater, is also an immensely political space. So it's somewhere that the emperor can be seen. It's somewhere that the people can go and shout at the emperor. It's somewhere where they can petition the emperor, where they can have visibility of him, but also, to connect with the imperial family. So the Colosseum, to be, will have a range of functions as a space, and a very important one. Vespasian decides he's going to build this amphitheater, but unlike any other amphitheater in the world. So he's putting his stamp on that particular space. And there's a whole set of things that go along with the idea of opening the Colosseum too. Games, of course, can be thrown. Spectacles can be thrown. The reenactments of battles that people haven't seen before, that they've heard about, that they've been taught about, can actually be showcased. And it's also a place where the empire can be on show as well. So the sorts of animals you could get, because remember, Rome has this incredible empire. So effectively, you can now go into the center of Rome, into the Colosseum, and see what these legionnaires are seeing on their journeys. So it actually brings the empire to the Roman population, and it showcases Vespasian's might and his reach. I then wondered, of course, what was at stake here. Is there a sense that you need to keep Rome satisfied, happy, overawed, calm in a way, because if you don't, is his dynasty in danger? So one of the things that Vespasian was able to do was understand the relationship between emperors and the people of Rome. And that understanding was crucial, and it made him an incredible benefactor. So benefaction was a huge way that the emperor interacted not only with the people of Rome, but also with the wider provinces. For Vespasian, it's going to be an incredibly big part of his gig, if you like. He needs to show himself as worthy of this new dynasty, to be a successor to some of the Judeo-Claudians. Vespasian, of course, also set up theaters, and of course we have the Circus Maximus. But this is Rome's amphitheater, and it's lasted well. I mean, you can sit here now, and yes, those ruins, they are astounding. And as you get close to the ruins, you realize just how enormous and complicated the Colosseum not only is today, but would have been back in the day. The Romans, if anything, were ingenious builders. And the Colosseum itself, with 80 archways, on that iconic external wall, that arena is actually made up of roughly 100,000 cubic meters of travertine stone and over 300 tons of iron clamps to hold it all together. Its foundations, and this blew me away, actually plunge 40 feet into the earth, into the site of effectively what was a drained lake. I mean, can you imagine I mean, can you imagine the engineering that it would have taken just to do that alone? And of course, the Romans relied heavily on the substance of Rome's own devising, concrete. If you didn't know it, the Romans actually invented concrete. Even their method for lifting the enormous stone blocks into the higher levels was an incredible feat of engineering. It had never been done before. The Colosseum, I think, is unique, and I don't use that word lightly. And it's unique because it's twice the size probably as any other amphitheater in the Roman world at that time. And it sits and stands over 65,000 people. Of course, I then wondered what technological hacks allowed them to build on this scale. And what I came to realize was that the Colosseum is basically a giant lesson in arches. The Romans didn't just build one or two, they actually stacked hundreds of them, one on top of the other, all made of these clever little wedge-shaped stones called vassors. And they're so simple, yet so ingenious. You slot them in place, drop in the keystone at the top, pull away the wooden scaffolding, and suddenly you've got an arch that holds itself up. How brilliant is that? What the Romans then did was take that simple arch and they stretched it. They stretched it lengthways, and what you've got when you do that is a barrel vault. And it looks like a bit of a tunnel. That's how they covered the endless passageways and corridors under the seating tiers. When you walked into the Colosseum as a spectator, you were actually moving through a forest of barrel vaults. But the real stroke of genius, my thinking, they crisscrossed those barrel vaults at right angles. And the intersection there is called a groin vault. And it was stronger, it was lighter, and it was more open than a plain tunnel. It let them build multiple levels of intersecting corridors without the whole thing caving in under its colossal weight. So when you stand inside the Colosseum today, what you're really looking at is a masterclass in Roman engineering. Voussoir arches everywhere, barrel vaults guarding the crowds, and groin vaults holding the whole monster together. So if you look at the Colosseum is basically a series of arches. And the really fascinating thing about the Colosseum is the way the Romans built it. They just didn't slap stone on stone. They used building techniques from all across the empire, layering them together almost like a statement of power, if you like, carved in marble and brick. Take a look at the columns, for example. On the lowest level, you'll see the simplest form, the Doric column, squat and strong, a flat plate at the top, no frills. Move up one tier, and suddenly we're in the Greek islands, staring at an elegant Ionic column with their graceful scrolls curling outward. And then higher still, we're at the third level, the full peacock display, if you like, Corinthian columns carved with anthus leaves, utterly flamboyant. In one building, the Romans showcase every style from their world, almost as if to say, this empire, these traditions, have a look, folks, because they're all ours now. But I have to say also, the Colosseum isn't just beautiful, it's practical. Those great arches weren't only for show, they let in light and, crucially, air. Imagine it. You're sitting in a massive bowl of stone in the middle of Italy in summer. There's no roof. There's no shade. The Mediterranean sun, blazing down. We've all been there. Without those arches letting the air circulate, the place would have been unbearable. The Romans understood that, and you know what? They solved it. And then think about the scale. How do you build something that high with stone that heavy in the 1st century AD? The answer? Cranes. Two types, actually. The first was an A-frame crane, a design so good it's actually still used today, 2,000 years later. But the real Roman workhorse was the treadwheel crane. Picture a giant hamster wheel, only instead of hamsters, you've got slaves walking inside it, powering the winch that hauls the stone skyward. Brutal, yes, but bloody effective. With enough men inside, you can actually scale the design up and lift almost anything. And the truly enormous jobs? Well, the Romans weren't shy about throwing up huge scaffolds of timber and hauling blocks up earthen ramps. Whatever it took, they did it. In many ways, the Colosseum was their version of a modern stadium. Take Rome's Olympic Stadium today. Banks of seating, great entrances to funnel the crowds in, a central arena. Swap out the footballers for gladiators, and the comparison is absolutely clear. Even the name has survived. Those entrances we still call vomitoria. Not because anyone was sick there, far from it, but because tens of thousands of people could be spewed out into the city in minutes. You know, a modern crowd controller would be impressed today. Of course, all of this costs money, huge sums of money. And in Rome, that meant the emperor's treasury, the fiscus. The fiscus paid for everything from military campaigns to public buildings, even the bread and the circuses that kept the mobs happy. And here's the twist, folks. That money came from the people's taxes. So the citizens paid their emperor, who then spent it on games to keep the citizens distracted and loyal. A neat, if slightly cynical circle. Emperors, of course, knew the stakes. They were smart guys. You know, a new ruler would often celebrate his arrival with a lavish game. Just to say, effectively, don't worry, I'm rich, I'm generous, I'm your man. You voted for the right person. If he lost a battle or there was a famine, out came the games again, dazzling the crowds while the empire quietly steadied itself. Bread and circuses, loyalty secured. That then had me thinking about the manpower to build something like this. And of course, when you think about it, it's not really a problem. Rome's empire had about 50 million people in the first century, and as many as 10 million of them were slaves. Slavery wasn't an ugly hidden truth of Roman life. It was very much woven into the fabric of their society. You know, slaves taught children. Slaves worked the farms, they mined the stone, and yes, they built the Colosseum. Most households, no matter how poor you were, had at least one. And keep in mind, 1 in 10, maybe 1 in 5 at a push in Rome itself would have been enslaved. The Romans lived with a constant awareness of what that meant, the ever-present fear of revolt. You know, think about Spartacus. He wasn't just a legend. He was a reminder. But still, they relied on that labor, and without it, the Colosseum would never have risen from the ground. So when you look at it today, remember this. The Colosseum wasn't just an arena. It was a mirror of Rome itself. Its styles spoke of conquest, its arches of engineering genius, its cranes and scaffolds of brute force, its crowds of politics and control. And behind it all, the silent work of millions who had no choice. Slavery in Rome wasn't just about building sites and gladiatorial games. It was a whole global trade, reaching to every corner of the empire. Slaves came from the fringes, Parthians from the east, Barbers from North Africa, even Britons who were being exported as slaves long before the island was actually formally conquered. Britain, in fact, had a reputation for it. And when Caesar marched into Gaul, keep this in mind, he killed over 1 million people and enslaved another million. Imagine the shockwaves of that. Roman markets suddenly flooded with Gauls, bound, branded, and sold like livestock. Later, after Rome's wars against the Cimbri and the Teutons, slave traders did a roaring trade in Germans. Millions of people funneled into Italy to fuel the engine of Roman Empire. And of course, it wasn't just armies capturing them directly. Just like Elizabethan traders buying in West Africa, the Romans could purchase slaves from networks that stretched across deserts and seas. Human trafficking is not a modern phenomenon, and I think the Romans industrialized it. That, of course, then had me wondering, what was life like for a slave? And the only conclusion that you can come to is grim. They would have had no legal personhood, no agency over your future. You were effectively just property. And yet the Roman system had one strange little wrinkle. You could, in theory, be freed. A slave who managed to save money or who impressed his master enough might be freed. Free men could vote, own property, even become wealthy. And keep in mind, the father of the Emperor Pertinax, for example, was actually born a slave, freed, and he went on to run a logging business in northern Italy, which made him fabulously rich. And of course, his son then sat on the throne, Pertinax the Younger. But of course, freed men had limits. Freed men couldn't hold public office. That door was firmly shut. So how did they prove their success? By monuments. If you walk through the Herculean Gate at Pompeii, you'll see tomb after tomb lining the road. Many belong to freed slaves. Great stone memorials declaring to the world, I made it. I succeeded. I mattered. They couldn't inscribe their names on the forum as magistrates, but they could carve their legacy into marble instead. And of course, not every slave could dream of freedom. The worst fate was to be condemned to the mines and the quarries, the Metalia. This was a living death. If you went in, you never came out. The empire's weapons, its buildings, its very roads were cut from stone, hacked out by condemned slaves, sweating and starving in the darkness. Rome's imperial might was built quite literally on their backs. And here's the thing. In many ways, slaves were the Romans' equivalent of our technology. We don't think twice about flicking on a light switch, turning on a tap, or pressing a button for our morning coffee. For Romans, it was exactly the same, only the machine was the human slave. You woke up in a townhouse already swept and cleaned. You ate your meals prepared by unseen hands in the kitchen. Your aqueducts brought fresh water. Your sewers carried away the waste. Your public baths gleamed. And behind all of that was slavery, the invisible, relentless technology of human Rome. So I then asked, well, what's in it for me as a slave to build an aqueduct or haul stone for the Colosseum? And I guess the answer is actually quite simple and very chilling, because the alternative is worse. Misbehave as a slave and you could end up in the mines or in the arena, or perhaps worst of all, nailed to a cross. Crucifixion in the Roman world was not a punishment for citizens. It was deliberately reserved for slaves. Why is that? Well, when Christ was crucified, the message was brutal and unmistakable. Here is someone placed at the very bottom of society. It's a slave's death, designed to strip away dignity as well as life. Outside the Equiline Hill in Rome, there was once a dumping ground for the bodies of crucified slaves. Burial pits filled with the discarded dead, dug up only later when the city expanded. And that is the brutal reality. And when you stand in front of the Colosseum, remember this. Thousands of the men who built it never ever saw it finished. They dropped where they stood, exhausted, beaten, and soon to be forgotten. There's no record of their names. There's no marker of their lives. Just laborers, endlessly replaceable. If the emperor needed 10,000 men for his new amphitheater, 10,000 men appeared. And if they died, another 10,000 would be brought in. I think it's very easy, for us to see the Colosseum through the lens of Hollywood. Russell Crowe standing in the middle of the arena shouting, are you not entertained? But the truth is very much darker. Building itself was a monument to suffering. Effectively, public murder took place inside its arena, but there was a lot of private murder in its construction as well. And slaves didn't just build it, they filled it. Many gladiators were slaves owned by the gladiatorial schools, institutions that trained them, housed them, and profited from their deaths. Most of them fought once or twice and then died, butchered in front of the crowd. But a few, the strong, the lucky, the skilled, fighters with that X factor, survived. And for these men, survival could mean so much more. It could mean glory and perhaps freedom. The first gladiatorial fights weren't about entertainment at all. Far from it. They were actually funerary rites. And at the funeral of a Roman senator in 264 BC, 6 warriors fought in pairs as a tribute to the dead. Blood to honor the departed, if you like. Over time, though, the ritual faded and the spectacle grew. And by the 2nd century BC, gladiatorial combat had become Rome's mass entertainment. Wealthy patrons and emperors staged games for prestige, but also for political favor, and the gladiator schools began to appear across the empire. And I can only imagine that inside those schools, life would have been strange. Brutal, yes, but it would also have been structured. Keep in mind, too, gladiators were valuable property. They lived in barracks, they ate in mess halls, and they trained in dedicated yards. They had their own doctors. They even had infirmaries. Because let's face it, if you're an owner, why let your investment rot? A gladiator wasn't just a slave. He was actually a valuable commodity. And the very best of them became something more. The first superstar athletes in history. By the 1st century, half of all gladiators were actually free men, volunteers effectively who'd signed contracts, drawn by the chance of huge prize money, glory, or for some, just simply the thrill of the fight. And just like athletes today, they were chosen for their physiques. Different builds suited different styles. The nimble, wiry men became net fighters, darting in with their tridents. The heavy-set men strapped on helmets and they hoisted massive shields and took the hit. Every fight was a spectacle, carefully staged for maximum drama. And make no mistake, these men were megastars. Their names carried across the empire. They were cheered, idolized, and whispered about. Children wanted to be them. Women wanted to sleep with them. They were far more famous than Olympians of today, whose glory is kind of fleeting and local. A gladiator's name could stretch from Rome to the very edges of the known world. And I think what's remarkable about gladiatorial training is that it wasn't some back alley improvisation. It was professional and systematic, and so rigorous, in fact, that the Roman army actually borrowed from it. They learned from it. Scipio Africanus himself, the general who defeated Hannibal, is said to have used gladiatorial training methods for all of his soldiers. Military drill and gladiator drill were essentially one and the same. And that tells you how intense this training was. Basically designed to turn men into champions, whether in the arena or on the battlefield. There are no lasting manuals for gladiators, but we do have Vegetius, who wrote about military training. And the overlap is actually very clear. He tells us that no man can succeed without fighting against the palace, the wooden post, the Roman equivalent of a punching bag, if you like. Gladiators would hack, stab, feint, and thrust at it, learning combinations the way a martial artist today practices katas. You've all seen the Bruce Lee films where he fights against a wooden post. This is exactly what that is. And their training was actually split into cycles, the tetrad, 4-day programs, each focused on different skills, like a gym routine today. And their diet was actually built on a thick barley stew. It was very heavy, filling, designed to bulk them up, not unlike the sumo wrestlers of Japan today. You would begin your career with a couple of exhibition matches, building your reputation, because your ultimate dream is clear. Just like in Gladiator, you need to get to the Colosseum. It's the Wembley of today, the Super Bowl. 65,000 people packed into the stands, chanting your name. Just the thought of walking out through those tunnels, hearing that roar, it would have been intoxicating. But you can't just fight well. You actually have to win the crowd. You need a signature move, something to set you apart. You make appearances in the days before the games, parading through the streets of Rome, lending your name to a politician's campaign, perhaps becoming a figure people will pay to see. Because in the end, this is show business, folks. And people would actually say, I'm not going unless Danicus is fighting. And that is how your fame was built. By the late 70s AD, the Colosseum itself was ready, almost. Vespasian, the emperor who commissioned it, died before he saw it completed. But of course, his son Titus took over, the first time in Roman history that power passed smoothly from father to son. And of course, Titus knew what he had to do. He would finish his father's vision. And when the Colosseum finally opened in AD 80, he promised a spectacle like no other. He demanded 100 days of games, 100 days, effectively, of executions, of beast hunts, of gladiatorial contests. 100 days to proclaim to the citizens of Rome that he was the most powerful person in the world. So, of course, then your mind runs to what would it have been like in the crowd on such a day like that. You know, you would have queued from early morning, ticket in hand, shuffling through one of the vomitoria into the great bowl of stone. At around 10 a.m., the day would begin with a procession. All the participants parading around the arena floor, a riot of color and anticipation, of music, of horns. And of course, then came the first act, the beast hunts. The Romans had a name for it. They called it venatio. And it was unlike anything seen before, or I have to say, thankfully, since. Wild animals from every corner of the empire, lions, tigers, bears, panthers, elephants, ostriches, all shipped to Rome on an industrial scale. Just imagine the logistics. Hunting expeditions across Africa and Asia 2,000 years ago, animals captured, caged, loaded onto ships, marched through ports, and finally released into the arena to be slaughtered for sport. North African mosaics actually still show the process. Hunters spearing leopards, wrangling crocodiles, driving terrified beasts into crates bound for Italy. And of course, once they arrived, emperors made the theatre their deaths. Commodus, the most infamous of them all, delighted in actually fighting animals himself, though, of course, the coward that he was, he had them drugged first. His party trick? Slicing the heads clean off running ostriches. And on one occasion, he killed 100 of them in succession, and then lifted a severed head, waved it at the senators in the stands, and laughed, "Step out of line, and this could be you." They had to laugh along, of course. He was the emperor. This was Rome's world on display. Its power, its cruelty, its wealth, all paraded before the crowd. The Colosseum wasn't just an arena, it was a stage on which Rome performed its supremacy effectively to itself. Those beast hunts weren't just a sideshow, they were the product of an empire-wide machine. Whole detachments of the Roman army became notorious for their animals and the animals they captured. If you were stationed in North Africa, you were expected to send lions, leopards, elephants back to Rome. If you're in the east, it might be tigers, hyenas, even rhinos. And yes, rhinos really did appear in the arena. If the empire spanned 3 continents, then every animal from those continents eventually made its way into the Colosseum. But of course, the games weren't only about animals or emperors play acting. The next act after the animals was darker still, public executions. And Romans didn't just kill people, they staged it. Executions were actually turned into theatre. The condemned, more often than not slaves, criminals, prisoners of war, were dressed as characters from Greek myth or Roman history. The stage itself might rise from beneath the arena floor, dressed as a set from legend. Imagine a slave forced to wear the head of a bull, acting out the myth of the Minotaur, only to be torn apart before the crowd. Or another scene, the great battle of Zama, elephants on the stage, the condemned dressed as Carthaginians, cut down in front of a roaring audience. So the Colosseum wasn't just a building, it was a machine. It chewed up slaves, animals, criminals, and gladiators alike, and spat out entertainment for the masses. And of course it worked. The crowd went home thrilled, distracted, convinced again of the empire's power, its reach, and of course its glory. And I think what strikes me most about the executions is that they weren't just about killing, they were about drawing it out. The psychological torture was actually part of the show. Everyone in the stands knew what was coming, and so did the condemned. The costumes, the staging, the delay before the inevitable blow. It was all designed to heighten the suspense, to make death even more dramatic. And I think that's the unsettling truth. What we find grotesque, they found ordinary. Imagine seeing this again and again and again until it became part of the rhythm of your life. Like going to the cinema today or watching a football match. For us, the idea of watching someone psychologically and physically tormented to death is abhorrent. But for them, it was just pure entertainment. That then makes you wonder, how much say did the crowd have in all this? And it's really hard to measure. Hollywood actually likes to show the emperor holding up or down a thumb, or the crowd roaring for mercy or death. But the reality, by the records that we have, is actually less clear. For those condemned to execution, Christians, criminals, prisoners, there was absolutely no way out. You were going to die no matter what. The spectacle was never in doubt. It was only the form that it would take. And we still don't know whether Christians were actually thrown to lions. There's speculation that there was. There's a lot of speculation that there wasn't, but we don't actually know. But what we do know is that during the times of persecution, especially under emperors like Nero or Diocletian, Christians were singled out as scapegoats. If a fire swept through Rome or a plague struck, the emperor needed someone to blame. And the Christians became the convenient targets. Their deaths, staged in the arena, served as both a punishment but also as a distraction. And of course, we still see that in politics today. As for what happened afterwards, well, there was no dignity, there was no ceremony. Bodies were dragged away like rubbish, leaving trails of blood across the sand. Slaves then would come on with rakes, burnish the surface clean, and within minutes, it was actually as if nothing had happened. The sand absorbed it all. The arena was then set for the next act, and the victims erased. That, I think, is the most chilling part of all, that the Colosseum actually devoured people in their thousands and left no trace. For the crowd, the spectacle ended with the blood that was swept away. For the victims, their existence actually ended with it. For most people who died in the arena, there was nothing. There was no marker, there was no dignity. Once you ceased to be useful as entertainment, you were effectively swept away like waste. But for the superstars, the rock star gladiators whose names were known across the empire, things could be very different. If one of them fell, their bodies might be carried out with a semblance of honor, given a more formal burial, mourned by the admirers. Fame in Rome, as in our own world, could buy you privileges even in death. And make no mistake, death was constant, all day, every day of the games. The blood flowed, and with it everything else. Entrails, dung, the stench of wild animals and broken men. The Colosseum absolutely reeked, and keeping it remotely tolerable required a constant industrial-scale water supply to wash the floor clean, sluicing away the filth between the bouts. Without it, the crowd would have literally gagged before the show was half done. The question then comes is, was there ever laughter in any of this? For us, no. Nothing in such carnage could be remotely funny. But the Romans, hardened by the sight of death from birth, thought very differently. They'd seen it all 100 times. To them, mockery and parody were very much part of the entertainment. Clowns, jugglers, even grotesque comic interludes were sometimes woven into the day's executions. The condemned dressed up in ridiculous costumes just before their deaths. The cruelty, in other words, was sometimes played to make the crowd laugh. And even then, there were showpieces. They had naval battles. Not every amphitheater could manage them, but the Romans were engineers without equal, if they were anything. With the right aqueducts, the right drains, even the Colosseum itself could be flooded. Imagine it, The arena floor filling with water, boats rowing out, gladiators battling among them while the crowd roared from above. Hugely expensive, yes. Hugely impractical, yes. But when it happened, it was Rome at its most extravagant, spending money and lives on a spectacle designed to echo across history. And of course, those naval battles, when they did happen, they were the stuff of legend. People talked about them literally for hundreds of years. They were rare, they were ruinously expensive, but they were unforgettable. The Romans could flood the entire arena, not just a corner of it, and they could stage mock sea battles with scaled down galleys. Imagine the engineering challenge just to do that. Waterproofing the floor, filling it with water, draining it again before the next event. It wasn't practical, which is why it was reserved for the most extravagant occasions. But when it happened, 65,000 people would have stood and saw an ocean conjured in stone. As a spectator, you weren't just there to watch. You could gamble. In fact, the arenas were hotbeds of legal and illegal betting, as you would imagine. Rome was one of history's great get-rich-quick societies. The gulf between the fabulously wealthy and the dirt poor was staggering. And for the masses, every chance to turn a small stake into a fortune was irresistible. People would gamble big, sometimes ruinously big, or their favorite gladiators. Betting on Danicus to win might change your life. But of course, you'd be there all day. And like any sporting event, food was a large part of the Colosseum experience. You would have started with a heavy breakfast outside, bread, eggs, cheese, just to keep you going. Inside the Colosseum, hawkers sold snacks all day, bags of fresh olives, hunks of fresh cheese, bruschetta without the tomatoes, of course, bread rubbed with olive oil and maybe topped with a little cheese or herbs, dried meats, nuts, simple things you could eat from your seat. And always wine, lots of wine, much safer than water and freely available. In fact, it was even encouraged, because if 65,000 people are stuck in the sun for hours, you want them mellow, not mutinous. Logistics, of course, were brutal. Hard stone seating, no shade, unless you were lucky enough to sit high up under the Great Valerium, the canvas awning that shaded parts of the crowd. Cushions would have been sold at the gate if you could afford one. If you couldn't, you sat on the hard stone. Then, of course, the question goes to, well, what about toilets? Well, with that many people penned in all day, the truth is actually pretty ugly. There were latrines at the edges of the structure, but many simply relieved themselves where they sat, which is why, if you were sensible, you always sat at the back, out of the sun, out of the stench, and out of the spray. The Colosseum wasn't glamorous for the audience any more than it was for the slaves or gladiators. It was messy, smelly, bloody, hot, but it was also intoxicating. This feast of violence, food, wine, and chants. An entire world crammed into a single day. When the gladiators finally fought, they did so on a wooden floor laid over a thick carpet of sand. Of course, the sand is essential. It absorbs the blood, the sweat, the filth. In fact, our very word for arena comes from the Latin arena, meaning sand. But what most visitors to Rome don't realize is that beneath the floor lay an entirely different world, the hypogeum, literally the underground. It wasn't part of the original structure. It was added later by Emperor Domitian, Vespasian's younger son, and it transformed the Colosseum. Suddenly you had a labyrinth of tunnels, passageways, and holding cells carved beneath the stage. This was the engine room, the backstage, the true beating heart of the Colosseum. Down there, in the half-dark, the air thick with heat and the stink of the animals, chaos would have reigned. Slaves wrestled lions and leopards into cages while condemned men waited their turn, listening to the roar of the crowd above, knowing exactly what it meant. Wounded gladiators were hauled past on stretchers, tended to in makeshift infirmaries. Torchlight flickered on damp walls. Shadows danced. Orders would have been barked. Whips would have been cracked. I mean, just imagine the noise alone. The groaning of the beasts, the shouting of the overseers, the groans of the dying. And the Hypogeum wasn't just a holding pen, it was a stage itself. Lifts and trapdoors allowed whole sets to rise dramatically into the arena above. Slaves dressed as Carthaginians might be herded into, a mock-up battle of Zama, complete with painted elephants and props. The scenery hauled up like a theatre production. Once the stage was set, the trapdoor opened, and up it went. The condemned marched into the light to lose the battle and their lives. The platform would then drop again, the bodies would be dragged away, the sand would be raked and washed clean, and the next act would begin. From above, the audience just saw magic. Entire landscapes rising from the ground, scenes from myth or history brought to life before their very eyes. But below, in the suffocating gloom, it must have been hell. I mean, this is where the Colosseum revealed itself not just as a theater, but as a working machine. A machine designed to grind men and beasts into blood and spectacle, one lever pull at a time. So if you're a gladiator, you rise at dawn. You would have a hearty breakfast, bread, porridge, as much as you want to fuel you through the day. And then you wait, because the gladiator fights come last. Remember, first the beasts, then the executions, and it's only in the afternoon, after hours in the stinking gloom, are you called to the arena. So you would spend your day stretching, rehearsing your moves, having your muscles massaged, trying not to think about the truth, that you may not come back. And when that moment comes, you're not let out quietly. You're paraded. You emerge from the trapdoor of the Hypogeum or stride through the grand gates, blinking into the blazing sun. The announcer bellows your name, your title, your record. Behind you, an attendant holds a placard listing your victories, your defeats, your background. Just like today's boxing cards, the Romans wanted statistics, and the crowd wants theatre. You would have raised your arms, brandished your net, posed with your trident, made yourself look like a giant and let out a roar. Because you are there to entertain. Going back to what Russell Crowe said, are you not entertained? Well, you were definitely there to entertain. You were there to entertain the emperor in his gilded box to the women sitting high at the back beneath the velarium. Every eye would have been on you. The music would have played, the crowd would have chanted your name, and for a moment, you're not a slave. You're an absolute rock star. You're the crowd's darling. You're Rome's hero. And then the fight. And keep in mind also, not every match is a fight to the death. Far from it. Most of the time, gladiators actually used blunted weapons. The emperor knows that a champion gladiator is far too valuable to throw away lightly. And keep in mind, he doesn't care about the sport. He cares about the crowd. And the crowd wants drama, not necessarily massacre. They've had that all day long. Fights are staged to thrill, to draw cheers, and to showcase your skill. But there is blood. There's always blood. Sometimes the weapons are sharp. Sometimes the order is given. And sometimes the crowd bays for death. And the emperor nods, and the end would have come quickly. For the champion fighters, death, as I've said, is rare. The arena wasn't a constant bloodbath of gladiator against gladiator. It was a theatre, brutal, bloody, an intoxicating theatre, a world of sand, sweat, and spectacle, of course. And when Rome's power shifted east, when the emperors moved their court to Constantinople, the Roman mob actually lost its importance. Their favour no longer mattered. And that's effectively why the gladiatorial combat faded away. Without a crowd to win, there was no point to the blood and the spectacle. And that's when the Colosseum fell silent, because the people of Rome no longer had political value. The Colosseum now is a ruin. It's half collapsed, its great stone ribs standing like the skeleton of a giant. But, it still has the power to silence you when you step inside, because those arches that stand, those tunnels, they remind us that Rome's glory was built on blood. I then wondered, as I left the Colosseum, would they have had gift shops? And they actually did. Even in ancient Rome, the place was ringed with stalls selling trinkets of every kind. You could pick up a lamp decorated with gladiators, or a little household statue for your family shrine. Minerva, goddess of wisdom, Mars, god of war, Venus, goddess of love. It was, in essence, merch, today's merch. The Romans loved a souvenir as much as we do. For more than 300 years, the Colosseum thundered with the roar of the crowd. And then, in the early 5th century, it fell eerily silent. Gladiatorial fighting was banned in 404 AD, just as the empire itself was collapsing under invasion, from plague, and from financial ruin. The Colosseum was no longer a priority. It later became a cemetery, a fortress, and later still a quarry. Its stones carted away to build churches and palaces and wealthy people's homes. By the 18th century, the Catholic Church declared the site sacred, saying it was a place where countless Christians had been martyred. Though, intriguingly, there is no archaeological evidence that executions of Christians to lions ever took place there. But by that stage, the Colosseum had become a ruin, not just of stone, but I think also of memory. It wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries that serious efforts to preserve it actually began. And today, of course, it is one of the most famous buildings on Earth. A wonder of the world, drawing more than 16,000 visitors a day. And of course, they come to stand in the shadows of its arches, to touch its stones, to imagine the roar of the crowd and the clash of steel on sand. What the Colosseum represents, I think, still grips us. It was the place where Rome revealed itself most starkly, brutal and magnificent, ingenious and cruel, political theatre, if you like, dressed as sport, a place where glory, death, and immortality were decided by the turn of an emperor's hand. And I think that's why, 2,000 years on, we're still fascinated by that particular building. Thanks for listening in, folks. Have a great week, and I'll chat to you again soon. Bye for now.